Hollywood remembers Marilyn Monroe as a finished product, a perfectly packaged fantasy that arrived fully formed and existed only to be admired. What history often forgets is that Marilyn Monroe was not a beginning, she was an outcome. Long before the image there was intention, long before the myth there was ambition, and long before the industry decided who she would be, she had already decided who she wanted to become. That conflict between intention and perception would define her entire career. Not because she lacked talent or discipline, but because Hollywood had already invested too much in keeping her exactly where she was. From the outside, Marilyn Monroe appeared to have everything an actress could want: fame, visibility, financial success, and a global audience that adored her. But success in Hollywood has always come with an unspoken rule: once an image becomes profitable, it becomes permanent. Marilyn's problem was not that she failed to evolve, it was that she tried. By the mid-1950s, Marilyn Monroe was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Her films were box office successes, her photographs circulated endlessly, and her public persona had become shorthand for a very specific fantasy. Blonde, naive, sensual, and harmless, this version of Marilyn was easy to sell, easy to control, and easy to dismiss. What it was not, however, was accurate. Behind the carefully lit smiles and choreographed innocence was a woman who read constantly, studied acting obsessively, and felt deeply frustrated by how little she was allowed to grow. Marilyn Monroe did not want to be admired from a distance. She wanted to be respected up close. She wanted roles with emotional weight, dialogue that mattered, and characters that reflected complexity rather than caricature. In an industry built on repetition, that desire alone made her a problem. Hollywood had no shortage of actresses who wanted attention. What it did not know how to handle was a woman who wanted authority over her own image. Marilyn's intelligence was inconvenient because it contradicted the fantasy. Her seriousness was threatening because it disrupted the joke. And her ambition was dangerous because it challenged a system that relied on actresses remaining grateful rather than demanding. The contradiction became impossible to ignore when Marilyn began openly expressing dissatisfaction with her roles. She was not subtle about it. She spoke about wanting better material, about being tired of playing the same character in different costumes. These were not the complaints of a diva. They were the observations of a professional who understood her limitations were being imposed externally. But Hollywood does not reward self-awareness in women whose value depends on illusion. At the time, Marilyn Monroe was under contract to 20th Century Fox, a studio system designed to control every aspect of an actor's career. Scripts, publicity, personal appearance, even romantic narratives were carefully managed. The system worked efficiently as long as the actor complied. Marilyn's refusal to comply quietly marked the beginning of her reputation as difficult. Not unreliable, not untalented, difficult. The label followed her everywhere. When she requested stronger scripts, she was described as ungrateful. When she questioned directors, she was called unprofessional. When she took acting seriously, she was accused of overthinking. These criticisms were rarely about her work. They were about her refusal to stay within the boundaries that made others comfortable. What made the situation worse was that Marilyn was right. The roles she was being offered were shallow, repetitive, and creatively limiting. Hollywood was not nurturing her growth because it did not believe growth was necessary. In fact, growth posed a risk. A Marilyn Monroe who could disappear into serious roles would no longer be predictable. And unpredictability threatens profit. The turning point came when Marilyn made a decision that few actresses of her era dared to consider. She walked away. At the height of her fame, she temporarily left Hollywood and moved to New York. The move was widely misinterpreted as emotional instability or career sabotage. In reality, it was strategic. New York represented something Hollywood could not offer her: legitimacy. In New York, Marilyn enrolled at the Actors Studio, studying under Lee Strasberg. This was not a publicity stunt. The Actors Studio was known for its intensity, discipline, and emotional rigor. It was a place where fame meant nothing and vulnerability meant everything. Marilyn thrived there not because it was easy, but because it was honest. For the first time, she was not being asked to perform an image. She was being asked to explore herself. Her commitment surprised many of her peers. Marilyn attended classes regularly, prepared obsessively, and took criticism seriously. She did not behave like someone indulging a hobby. She behaved like someone rebuilding her foundation. This version of Marilyn Monroe does not fit comfortably into popular memory because it contradicts the assumption that she was merely lucky. But while Marilyn was evolving, Hollywood remained unchanged. The industry did not celebrate her growth. It resented it. Studio executives viewed her absence as a disruption rather than an investment. Her refusal to return immediately to familiar roles was framed as arrogance rather than courage. The message was clear. She could study all she wanted, but she would still be expected to return as the same character she left behind. This created an impossible position. If Marilyn returned without change, she betrayed herself. If she returned changed, she disappointed the system that profited from her stagnation. The more seriously she took her craft, the more isolated she became professionally. Respect was something she pursued relentlessly, but it was also something Hollywood withheld deliberately. By the time Marilyn returned to film work, she was no longer just fighting typecasting. She was fighting a narrative that portrayed her ambition as instability, her intelligence as fragility, and her self-advocacy as emotional weakness. The irony was cruel. The very traits that defined serious actors were used against her because they did not align with the fantasy she represented. Marilyn Monroe did not fail to be taken seriously because she lacked seriousness. She failed because Hollywood never intended to let her succeed on those terms. And once an industry decides who you are allowed to be, escaping that definition becomes more difficult than achieving fame in the first place. When Marilyn Monroe returned from New York, she did not come back as the same actress Hollywood had sent away. She came back more disciplined, more self-aware, and far more determined to shape her own career. That transformation should have been celebrated. Instead, it triggered resistance. The studio system had never been designed to accommodate growth, especially when that growth came from a woman whose value had been carefully simplified for mass consumption. Marilyn's seriousness was no longer invisible. It was now openly inconvenient. The tension between Marilyn and 20th Century Fox intensified almost immediately. The scripts offered to her showed little evolution, and the characters remained trapped in the same shallow archetype that had defined her early success. Marilyn recognized this not as coincidence, but as policy. Studios believed audiences wanted familiarity, and familiarity required repetition. From their perspective, Marilyn's job was not to surprise but to reassure. Rather than accept this quietly, Marilyn made another decision that directly challenged Hollywood's power structure. She formed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. In the context of 1950s Hollywood, this was an extraordinary move. Very few actors, especially actresses, were granted that level of autonomy. Fewer still attempted to claim it themselves. This was not an act of rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was an attempt to gain creative leverage, to choose material that reflected her ambitions rather than her reputation. The response was swift and unforgiving. Studio executives viewed the move as an act of defiance. Marilyn was no longer seen as an asset that could be managed, but as a liability that demanded negotiation. Her desire for control was reframed as instability. Her insistence on quality was reframed as uncooperativeness. The narrative surrounding her began to shift, not because her behavior had changed, but because her position had. The media played a crucial role in this transformation. Coverage of Marilyn's career increasingly emphasized delays, disagreements, and supposed temperament. Context was stripped away. The reasons behind her objections were ignored. What remained was a simplified story, a star who could not handle her own success. This framing was not accidental. It aligned perfectly with Hollywood's need to discredit her demands without addressing them. Behind the scenes, Marilyn continued to work intensely. She prepared meticulously for roles, invested deeply in character development, and applied the techniques she had learned at the actor's studio. Films like Bus Stop and The Prince and the Showgirl revealed a more nuanced performer, one capable of restraint and emotional complexity. Critics began to notice, but institutional respect lagged behind individual recognition. The problem was not performance, the problem was permission. Marilyn was improving faster than Hollywood was willing to acknowledge. Each step she took toward legitimacy widened the gap between how she saw herself and how the industry chose to portray her. The more she proved her capability, the more aggressively the system questioned her reliability. This contradiction placed Marilyn in a psychologically exhausting position. To be taken seriously, she had to push harder, but pushing harder produced backlash. Any sign of vulnerability was seized upon as evidence that she was not built for responsibility. Exhaustion was interpreted as weakness. Frustration was interpreted as hysteria. In an industry dominated by men who rarely faced such scrutiny, Marilyn's emotional transparency became a liability rather than a human response. What made this especially damaging was the way these narratives followed her into every professional space. Directors approached her expecting difficulty, crews anticipated disruption, even allies began to absorb the mythology surrounding her. Marilyn was no longer evaluated solely on her work, but on the reputation constructed around her resistance. This feedback loop made genuine collaboration increasingly rare. Despite this, Marilyn did not retreat. She continued to advocate for herself, even as the cost mounted. She understood that accepting the limitations imposed on her would ensure comfort, but guarantee creative stagnation. What she underestimated was how much the system would punish her for refusing to conform. Hollywood did not simply deny her seriousness, it weaponized her pursuit of it. The label of difficult became a professional death sentence disguised as concern. It allowed studios to undermine her credibility while maintaining the appearance of fairness. After all, they were not denying her opportunities, they were responding to her behavior. This logic ignored the power imbalance at play. Marilyn was fighting an entire infrastructure designed to preserve itself. By the late 1950s, Marilyn Monroe occupied a paradoxical position. She was one of the most famous women in the world, yet she had less control over her career than many lesser-known actors. Her influence was cultural, not institutional. And culture, while powerful, offered little protection against an industry determined to maintain hierarchy. As the pressure increased, so did the isolation. Marilyn's attempts to redefine herself professionally were met with skepticism rather than support. Each setback reinforced the narrative that ambition was dangerous for someone like her. The tragedy was not that Marilyn failed to be taken seriously. It was that she was never given a fair environment in which seriousness could be rewarded. By the time the decade began to close, the conflict had taken a visible toll. Marilyn was still working, still striving, but the energy required to fight both perception and reality was immense. The industry that had elevated her was now eroding her from within. And while the public continued to see the image Hollywood projected, the woman behind it was growing increasingly tired of proving something that should never have been questioned. By the time Marilyn Monroe entered the final phase of her career, the conflict between who she was and who she was allowed to be had hardened into something structural. This was no longer a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a strong performance or a successful film. It was a narrative that had settled, repeated often enough to become accepted as truth. Marilyn was not simply seen as difficult, she was expected to be. And expectations in Hollywood have a way of shaping outcomes long before the work begins. The psychological weight of this label was profound. Marilyn understood that every delay, every question, every moment of hesitation would be interpreted through the same lens. Her behavior no longer existed in isolation. It was constantly measured against a reputation she had not chosen and could not escape. This awareness created an environment of permanent self-surveillance. She was not just performing on screen. She was performing stability, professionalism, and gratitude at all times. What made this especially destructive was that Marilyn's seriousness as an actress required vulnerability. The techniques she had embraced demanded emotional openness, introspection, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, but Hollywood interpreted vulnerability selectively. When it served male actors, it was praised as depth. When it appeared in Marilyn, it was framed as fragility. The very tools she used to improve her craft were repurposed as evidence against her. As her career progressed, the gap between effort and reward widened. Marilyn worked harder than ever to be taken seriously, yet the acknowledgement she sought remained conditional. Praise came with caveats. Opportunities arrived with constraints. Success was always described as surprising, as if competence had never been expected in the first place. This constant undermining eroded confidence not because she doubted her talent, but because she was forced to justify it endlessly. Isolation intensified the problem. The more Marilyn asserted herself, the fewer safe professional spaces remained. Trust became difficult when motives were unclear and alliances were fragile. She could not fully rely on studios that questioned her authority, nor on a media ecosystem that benefited from portraying her as unstable. Even well-intentioned collaborators were often constrained by the same system that limited her. Support was present, but it was rarely powerful enough to change outcomes. This isolation was often misinterpreted as self-destruction. From the outside, Marilyn's struggles appeared erratic and inexplicable. From the inside, they were cumulative. Years of being misunderstood, dismissed, and controlled had created a fragile equilibrium. Maintaining it required constant effort. Any disruption, professional or personal, threatened collapse not because she was weak, but because the margin for error had been reduced to almost nothing. Hollywood's refusal to take Marilyn seriously was not passive. It manifested in subtle exclusions, delayed projects, and the quiet reassignment of authority. Decisions were made around her rather than with her. Her insights were tolerated but rarely prioritized. Over time, this reinforced a painful realization. Respect was not something she could earn through excellence alone. It was something that had to be granted by those who already held power. The emotional toll of this realization cannot be overstated. Marilyn had been taught that hard work and improvement would lead to recognition. When that equation failed, the result was not resignation but confusion. She continued to push forward, believing that one more role, one more performance, one more demonstration of seriousness might finally shift perception. What she did not fully grasp was that the resistance she faced was ideological rather than evaluative. The industry needed Marilyn to remain a symbol, not an equal. Symbols are admired but not listened to. They are preserved, not consulted. Marilyn's attempt to cross that boundary disrupted an unspoken hierarchy. Her refusal to accept symbolic status without substantive authority was seen as ingratitude. The cost of that defiance was not immediate dismissal, but gradual erosion. As opportunities narrowed, scrutiny intensified. Any sign of strain was magnified. Any misstep was remembered. Marilyn's humanity, which had always existed beneath the image, became increasingly visible at a moment when visibility was least forgiving. The industry that had once celebrated her openness now used it as justification for exclusion. This period marked a turning point, not because Marilyn stopped trying, but because the fight itself became unsustainable. Fighting perception required more energy than the work it was meant to enable. The pursuit of seriousness, once motivating, began to feel like a burden imposed by an environment unwilling to meet her halfway. Marilyn Monroe did not lose her ambition. She lost the illusion that ambition alone could overcome structural resistance. Hollywood's refusal to take her seriously was not the result of a single decision or conflict. It was the outcome of a system designed to benefit from her image while resisting her autonomy. In the end, Marilyn's struggle was not simply about acting roles or creative control. It was about recognition as a full participant rather than a controlled asset. That recognition never fully arrived, and the absence of it shaped not only the final years of her career, but the way her legacy would be understood long after her voice was gone. By the time Marilyn Monroe's career approached its final chapter, the damage caused by years of resistance, misinterpretation, and structural exclusion had already reshaped how she moved through the world. This was not the collapse of a star who failed to adapt. It was the exhaustion of a woman who had spent her entire adult life negotiating for legitimacy in an environment that depended on denying it. Hollywood did not destroy Marilyn by rejecting her outright. It did something far more insidious. It allowed her to continue working while quietly stripping meaning from that work. The legacy of this struggle can be seen in how Marilyn Monroe is remembered. Popular culture freezes her in images rather than processes. Photographs, poses, and iconic moments are endlessly recycled, while the context that produced them is gradually erased. The seriousness she fought for is often treated as a footnote, an interesting contradiction rather than a defining feature. This selective memory is not accidental. It preserves the comfort of the myth while avoiding responsibility for the conditions that sustained it. Marilyn's pursuit of respect challenged Hollywood at a fundamental level. If she were acknowledged as serious, the system would be forced to admit that it had limited her intentionally. It would have to confront the reality that her typecasting was not inevitable, but convenient. By keeping her framed as fragile or unstable, the industry protected itself from accountability. Her struggles became personal failures rather than predictable outcomes of systemic constraint. This reframing extended beyond her lifetime. Discussions of Marilyn's career often emphasize what she lacked rather than what she was denied. Her difficulties are pathologized, while the pressures that created them are minimized. The narrative suggests that if she had been stronger, more disciplined, or less emotional, she might have succeeded on her own terms. What this ignores is that strength alone does not dismantle hierarchies. Discipline alone does not rewrite contracts. Emotional restraint does not equal institutional power. The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe is not that she was misunderstood in moments. It is that she was consistently understood incorrectly. Her intelligence was interpreted as insecurity. Her preparation was seen as hesitation. Her desire for control was framed as instability. Each misreading reinforced the next, until the gap between who she was and who she was allowed to be became unbridgeable. Hollywood's refusal to take Marilyn seriously did not prevent her from becoming an icon. It ensured that her iconography would overshadow her intentions. This imbalance continues to shape how audiences engage with her story. Admiration replaces analysis. Nostalgia replaces accountability. The image remains safe because it does not ask uncomfortable questions about power, gender, and control. Yet when her career is examined without the filter of myth, a different picture emerges. Marilyn Monroe was not asking for special treatment. She was asking for proportional recognition. She wanted the freedom to fail and succeed on equal terms. She wanted the ability to evolve without being punished for deviation. These requests were modest in principle, but radical in practice within a system built on rigid roles. The fact that she never fully received that recognition does not diminish her seriousness. It confirms it. Marilyn's struggle exposes the limits of an industry that rewards compliance over growth. Her story demonstrates how easily ambition is tolerated when it aligns with expectation, and how quickly it is rejected when it challenges control. In the end, Marilyn Monroe did not lose her voice. It was filtered. It was softened, redirected, and eventually archived beneath layers of imagery that obscured its intent. What survives most clearly is not the woman she worked to become, but the version Hollywood found easiest to sell. Revisiting Marilyn's career with honesty requires more than empathy. It requires reassigning responsibility. Her difficulties were not isolated incidents but patterns. Her frustrations were not personal flaws but rational responses. And her desire to be taken seriously was not a contradiction of her image, but a rejection of its limitations. Hollywood refused Marilyn Monroe seriousness because seriousness would have required change. It would have required acknowledging her authority, adjusting its expectations, and sharing control. The industry chose preservation over progress. Marilyn paid the price for that choice. Remembering her fully means resisting the temptation to simplify her. It means recognizing that behind the image was not just a woman, but a sustained effort to be seen clearly in a system that benefited from blurring her edges. Marilyn Monroe did not fail to become serious. She revealed how difficult seriousness becomes when the world insists on seeing you as something else.